All right, welcome, and thank you for attending today's discussion. This is part two of a three-part series on trauma-informed care for children with intellectual developmental disabilities. Today, we're going to be talking about understanding traumatic stress responses. I'm Dr. Ruth Brown. I'm an assistant professor at Virginia Commonwealth University in the Department of Psychiatry and at the Institute for Psychiatric and Behavioral Genetics. I'm also the director of the Hope Lab that works to achieve equity in mental health and trauma-informed services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We have three main learning objectives in the talk today. First, I'm going to describe the impacts of trauma on child development, behavior, and functioning. This is going to be just a kind of a broad overview of how trauma affects child development in general. Then we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about how trauma can impact youth with developmental disabilities in particular. And then finally, we'll identify ways in which trauma may impact children you work with. Before we begin, I'd like to make some acknowledgements. Much of the material in this presentation is adapted from the Road to Recovery Toolkit, which was developed by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. It's available for free on the NCTSN Learning Center. The link is here. It's kind of a long link, but that'll be included in the kind of resources list for the presentation. And if you just search for National Child Traumatic Stress Network Road to Recovery, you should be able to find that. That's a great resource if you want to really dive into this topic and learn more. There are a lot of great resources available there. Okay, as we did with the first presentation, I want to start by taking a moment to pause and think about what it is that connects you to this work. The goal of this is to be able to give you some ideas and concepts and strategies that you can use and apply in your kind of day-to-day work with children in schools or whatever setting you may be in. So take a moment to think about what, kind of encouraged you or brought you to this training today. Why did you decide to tune in today? Is it a professional reason? Are there children that you work with in your classroom or at your school? Is it a personal reason? Do you yourself have a loved one who has an intellectual developmental disability? So take a moment to think about what connects you to that work. So take a minute to write down some ideas. Or if you're listening while you're driving or catching up on the mountain of paperwork that you have, take a moment to just pause and think about the people or the person who connects you to this work. And identify a couple of questions that you might like to learn more about. And hopefully we'll address those in this talk. Feel free to ask any questions that you want in the kind of post the questions online or use that as an impetus to kind of do a little bit more research if we don't cover it in the talk. So I'm going to give us just a moment to write down what connects you to this work. Okay, so we'll start with just a little bit of a review about what we mean by trauma. So trauma is an emotional reaction to an event that is perceived as threatening to a person's life, safety, or body that overwhelms the person's ability to cope. So what is and is not traumatic can vary from person to person. It's about perception, and not everybody perceives things the same way. Not everybody reacts the same way. But the main idea is that there's a perceived sense of threat, and the person feels like they cannot kind of cope with it in that moment. So traumatic events themselves. So there's a difference between a traumatic response and a traumatic event. But these are some examples of things that can cause a traumatic response. So they can include things like physical or sexual abuse, abandonment or neglect, death or loss of a loved one, a life-threatening illness, witnessing domestic violence, witnessing neighborhood violence, witnessing police activity, bullying, threats of violence, medical procedures, motor vehicle accidents, natural disasters, fires, exposure to violence on TV, news, or media, housing and financial or food instability, and parental mental illness. So it's important to recognize the wide scope of, of events that can cause stress and trauma in a child's life. So there are also different ways of kind of thinking about trauma as well. There are single traumatic experiences. So a child may experience a car accident, an isolated event, or a natural disaster, where there's kind of one specific event that can be identified as being traumatic. Sometimes traumatic experiences occur together. So for example, domestic violence and physical abuse commonly co-occur together, but not always. There are experiences that can extend over a long period of time, such as neglect or ongoing sexual abuse. So rather than it being one specific event, it's an event that occurs over and over and over again. There are also mass traumas. For example, natural disasters like hurricanes and tornadoes and things that affect a whole community. Civil unrest and pandemics are very relevant ones right now, that where the whole community or even the whole world has been impacted by them. And then there are experiences that are a mixture of all of these above. For example, with the pandemic, that's been a situation in which the whole, a person's whole community, whole environment has been impacted. And for some, there were kind of other traumas kind of compounded on top of that. So maybe a life-threatening illness of a loved one, or being at home and witnessing domestic violence, or child abuse, or things like that, where these things kind of occur together. And these can impact the way in which a child or a family caregiving system kind of responds to that trauma. We typically think of kind of single traumatic experiences as being less impactful, although not always, than those that become much more complex. And so as these things kind of occur over an extended period of time, impact more people, then that adds layers and layers of complexity onto the trauma, which can sometimes increase the likelihood that a person may experience difficulty coping and recovering from that experience. But again, even a single traumatic experience can be enough to result in traumatic stress. Besides the event itself, there are kind of other factors that can influence the degree of a trauma response. And so there are those factors that we consider kind of pre-trauma factors. And that might be, kind of what was the person's life like before the trauma? Did they have a stable environment? Was it unstable? Do they have supportive kind of family members and caregivers? What resources were available to them, both kind of financial and tangible resources, as well as, kind of internal characteristics, their own kind of cognitive resources, emotional resources that they had, before the event happened. What pre-existing strengths and weaknesses were there? So kind of how a person was doing before the trauma can impact then how they react to the trauma itself. In addition to the pre-trauma experiences, the nature of the trauma itself can also impact the person's response. So we mentioned a little bit before some of the, the features of whether it was single or ongoing, but also the person's kind of abilities themselves to respond in the moment. So for example, if it involved kind of injury or violence, was the person able to defend themselves? For somebody who has mobility impairments, maybe they weren't able to physically defend themselves. For a person with cognitive or other impairments, maybe they weren't able to really understand and, and process what was happening in the moment. What was their understanding of what happened and why? And we'll talk about this a little bit later in terms of kind of children or people with limited kind of cognitive development, that they may be more likely to blame themselves for what happened, because of their understanding of the world and cause and effect. And so that may put a person at increased risk of having a more severe traumatic response. And then finally, there's what happened after the trauma. And so sometimes these traumas cause a whole cascade of events to follow. So maybe a child is removed from their home and they lose their home and their pets and their belongings, their friends, their school, their whole support network all changes. And so that process can compound the trauma. Were they believed or supported, after the fact. And research shows that, for people who experience, sexual abuse, for example, to the extent that they were believed and supported in that process afterwards predicts lifelong, adjustment and psychological functioning. And so these are all factors to kind of consider. And it calls upon us, as caregivers and providers and educators, to really put ourselves in the shoes of the child and the family when we're talking about kind of trauma and the effects of trauma. And I think much of this talk today and kind of talking about this is really at its core, an invitation to kind of be open and empathic and really think about and put ourselves in their shoes to really help us to gain some awareness of what that person may be experiencing and what that person may need in order to be able to help them to feel safe and supported, so that they can engage in the classroom, maximize the learning, and also just increase their well-being. Okay, so we mentioned a little bit more about traumatic stress. So we're going to break it down into a little bit more detail. So we mentioned before, kind of experiencing or witnessing. So a person doesn't have to experience the event themselves, but seeing something happen to somebody else can be traumatic. And that can cause a real or a perceived threat to the person's emotional or physical well-being. The event is of such intensity and seriousness that it kind of registers in the person's body and mind. And more and more research shows that that experiencing stress, experiencing trauma, kind of leaves, kind of real, has real effects on our biology, and so kind of traumatic stress, is that process. The reactions persist and interfere with the ability to function even after the traumatic event has ended. So in the immediate aftermath of a trauma, experiencing many of the kind of symptoms and things that we've talked about are normal and expected. Most people, experience distressing thoughts and intrusions and hypervigilance and a lot of these symptoms. And that's a normal kind of reaction to the event. But over time, those tend to decrease and decline. But when we're talking about somebody who has kind of ongoing traumatic stress, such as post-traumatic stress disorder or other stress-related disorders, it persists and then it interferes with their ability to function afterwards. And so then over time, a pattern of symptoms or kind of common patterns of symptoms that may develop that may be kind of diagnosable as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is what most people are familiar when we talk about trauma and traumatic stress. However, trauma can put people at risk for a range of other mental health disorders beyond PTSD. And so there's a whole kind of category of diagnoses, but also things like depression and anxiety, as substance use can all be kind of downstream effects of trauma. We tend to think about the symptoms, kind of hallmark symptoms of post-traumatic stress and other stress-related disorders as impacting a person's kind of thought patterns. They experience distressing and intrusive thoughts or images of the trauma, reminders of the trauma. They may have increased difficulty regulating emotions, and that could include intense emotions, intense outbursts, or blunted emotions where the person becomes, kind of numb and robotic. It can include hyperarousal, startle reflexes, and increased sensitivity to touch or sound, and difficulty trusting others. So these are some really hallmark symptoms. So let's talk a little bit then about how trauma can impact child development. So what is development? So when we're talking about development, what we're talking about is a process of change by which people become able to handle even more complex levels of moving, thinking, feeling, and relating to others. So this is a lifelong process. There are many domains of development that can include language development, motor development, cognitive development, adaptive development, and social and emotional development. So we'll go do a little overview of each of these kind of areas of development. Okay, so for language development, there are three main types of language development. Expressive language, which is our ability to communicate with others through sounds, gestures, or words. Receptive language development is our ability to recognize sounds and understand spoken language. And then pragmatic communication is our ability to use nonverbal and social communication. So that may include things like interpreting people's facial expressions, altering the tone of our voices to communicate different emotions. And something that's really important to remember for people with intellectual disabilities is that these don't always kind of map on to each other. They don't progress at the same rate. And so for some people, for example, they may have kind of reduced expressive language, but kind of relatively higher receptive language. So they may understand more than what they're able to communicate. And oftentimes we tend to use, I think just kind of naturally, a person's level of expressive language to kind of infer what their receptive language is. And this can be a mistake and can be a challenge because we may be communicating with someone or assume that they don't understand something because they're not able to express themselves when in fact they do understand. Motor development includes kind of gross motor and fine motor, so their ability to use large muscle groups, walking and running. Fine motor development includes the more kind of precise writing and manipulating small things, tying their shoes. Cognitive development includes kind of a whole range of abilities, including their ability to pay attention and to focus, memory, spatial ordering, kind of arranging things in space, sequential ordering, being able to kind of put things kind of based on time or order in which things need to be done, problem solving, and social thinking. These are just a few. Adaptive functioning then are just kind of skills, daily living skills, ability to do things, kind of in our environment, taking care of ourselves, such as eating, toileting, bathing, being out in the community, kind of home living skills, and health and safety skills. And a lot of our kind of time, as educators or therapists, we spend a lot of time for children with intellectual and developmental disabilities kind of on these domains: language, speech and language therapies, occupational therapies, physical therapies, working on cognitive skills, working on adaptive skills, kind of teaching those, and those are all really important. Right, social and emotional development encompasses self-identity, how a person perceives themselves, their relationships with other people and ability to form close emotional bonds, understanding and adherence to social norms, sensory preferences and sensitivities, and emotion regulation. And these skills are really important for long-term outcomes, long-term well-being. There's a lot of research that shows that social and emotional development predicts long-term well-being, mental health, financial, and occupational outcomes. So these are really important skills that we really kind of need to spend a lot more time. And we oftentimes, for people with intellectual disabilities, don't spend quite as much time working on these skills when really they're very critical for their long-term outcomes, and especially important for responding to traumatic experiences. So one important framework for understanding development is, especially kind of social emotional development, is Erikson's theory of development. This is a stage-based theory. It suggests that, that people go through kind of predictable stages throughout their life, depending on their age. And for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, we see them, kind of progressing through many of these same stages as well. So in infancy, that's from 0 to 18 months, a child is really working on developing a sense of trust, recognizing, whether or not their caregivers respond to them when they cry, when they have needs. Do they comfort them when they're upset or scared? Do they feed them when they're hungry, change them when their diapers are dirty? And this builds a really foundational feeling of trust and an ability of, can I trust the world? Can I rely on the world to be there for me, to support me, and to help me? For children with intellectual and developmental disabilities, this may be especially crucial because they are often dependent upon caregivers for much longer periods of time. And so to the extent that they develop a sense of trust in their environment versus feeling a sense of mistrust is really vital. In early childhood, from about 2 to 4 years old, children are developing a sense of autonomy and being able to make choices and do things for themselves. This is that age when kids want to do it themselves. I do it. I want to do it, because they're really learning that they have control over their bodies. They have control over their choices and want to do things. And they're developing this sense of, is it okay to be me? In preschool, at about age 4 to 5, children are developing a sense of initiative. And that means that they are, kind of starting tasks, learning how to begin, to do work, to explore the things that interest them. And the kind of existential question that's associated with this is it okay for me to do, move, and act? They're kind of starting to explore more away from their caregivers, really just exploring their world. For school-age children, about 5 to 12, they're developing a sense of industry and in developing this existential question of, can I make it in the world? Can I do things? If this isn't successfully completed, they develop a sense of inferiority and feeling like they can't do things, and develop a sense of helplessness. In adolescence, from about 13 to 19 years old, children really developing their sense of identity. They want to understand kind of, who am I? Who can I be? They're looking at the skills that they have and thinking about their future, and developing, kind of career or occupational choices, and really figuring out just kind of who they are. And this is common for kids at this age. We see this a lot, kind of trying on different identities. They may from day to day dress differently, act differently, associate with different friends, as they're kind of trying on different identities and really exploring that. And that's a normal process for adolescents. Development continues on into adulthood, as people develop, connections with others, start to develop romantic relationships, kind of looking back and, kind of giving to their community and giving to previous generations, which we won't talk about since the focus of this is on childhood. So the way that trauma can impact, so the timing at which trauma occurs can impact development. Kind of as children are going through these different developmental stages and thinking about, and developing their sense of identity and their skills and capabilities, that trauma can impact kind of how that process goes. And so, as we mentioned in early childhood, the kind of developmental tasks that children are doing is kind of being able to attach to a primary caregiver. They're developing visual and auditory perception skills as they're exploring the world, learning to do, kind of puzzles and visual perception and things like that. They're also learning to recognize emotional cues, both within themselves and in others. And then they're developing a greater sense of independence and capacity, and developing a sense or developing a capacity to assess danger in others. So trauma during this time period can result in a number of different kind of symptoms and behaviors. So we may see changes in eating and sleeping. Child may become passive and quiet when they weren't before. They may have heightened startle responses. They may experience confusion about what is dangerous and who to go to for protection, especially if trauma occurred at the hands of a caregiver. They may experience fear from being separated from familiar people or places, an increase in separation anxiety. And they may engage in regressive behaviors. Which means that they kind of revert back to kind of more babyish or younger, kind of childlike behaviors. They may lose some of the developmental skills that they had previously had. In middle childhood, the developmental tasks that children are kind of working on developing include managing fears, anxiety, and aggression. Their kind of emotion regulation skills are kind of increasing. They're developing a greater ability to sustain attention and engage in more learning and problem solving. And they're better able to control impulses and manage physical responses to danger. However, for children who've experienced trauma during this time period, they may be experiencing a lot more intrusive thoughts and images. They may have preoccupations with moments from the traumatic experience. So they may be kind of reliving or reimagining that experience. They may be replaying the traumatic event. They may develop intense or specific new fears, that may be associated with the traumatic experience. They may start to engage in avoidant and reckless behaviors. And also sleep and concentration challenges can interfere with that. So as they're learning to be able to develop attention, if they experience trauma, that's going to challenge them in being able to learn how to sit in the classroom, how to focus, how to engage in problem solving. And so that can really disrupt that process. Trauma in adolescence and young adulthood. Typically during this time, youth are developing the ability to think abstractly. Before this, they tend to think very concretely and very kind of black and white, kind of absolutes. Versus, as they start to enter in adolescence, they can start to think about abstract concepts like fairness and justice and love. They can start to really think more about the consequences of their behavior and kind of project more into the future. Whereas for younger kids, that they're not really thinking, they're kind of more impulsive and not really thinking about in the moment what's going to happen if they do X, Y, or Z. They're more able to accurately judge danger and safety. And again, that kind of those impulse control abilities continue to develop, and they're better able at deferring gratification because they're able to think through the consequences. If I do this, this will happen. If I don't do this, this other thing will happen. But for a child who experiences trauma during this time, they may start to feel embarrassed or angry about their emotions, because they are also developing more kind of social awareness. They're concerned more about how other people think about them. They tend to see themselves as being kind of the center of the universe. They're egocentric. And so they may feel much more self-conscious about the feelings that they have. Whereas for young children, they're just experiencing their emotions. Now there's a kind of a second layer of shame on top of having those kinds of reactions. They may have difficulty imagining or planning for the future, whereas this is something where they're starting to think more and more about their future. Trauma can really impact that and kind of give them a sense of maybe they're not going to make it to the future. Maybe they're not going to live to adulthood. They may experience greater sense of, helplessness or low self-esteem. They're really working on developing relationships with others and, developing kind of trust of peers and trust in romantic relationships, and trauma may really impede that ability to do that. And they may be engaging in much more reckless or self-destructive behaviors, including substance use, cutting, and other self-injurious behaviors. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the specific ways in which trauma can impact children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So as we talked, in the previous slides, trauma can impact kind of typical child development. And, at any age or stage of development, it has, there are some kind of general impacts, but then also more kind of specific developmental impacts. And when people endure multiple traumatic events over long periods of time, they're going to have even greater difficulty. And so, for a person who is already experiencing some challenges in kind of working through these developmental stages and developmental challenges because of an intellectual or developmental disability, then the experience of trauma can kind of compound some of those effects. So some of the ways in which we see this is in added complexity. So for a child with IDD, there are moment-to-moment reactions, kind of during the event itself, can be more complex due to physical, cognitive, or communicative limitations. And that can impact kind of a wide range of protective actions that were possible during the traumatic experience. So as I mentioned before, were they able to defend themselves? Were they able to seek safety? Were they able to, to kind of cope with that in the moment? Kind of life experiences of the person. Again, those kind of pre-trauma experiences. So it's important to understand the kind of traumatic experience itself and the context of how IDD was already affecting that person's day-to-day life. So did they already have challenges with accessing services and supports? Did they have a lot of medical complications and have kind of frequent surgeries, or were they in the foster care system and kind of having multiple caregivers? So all of those things are really important to understand, kind of how the person's pre-existing disability kind of impacted their reaction to the trauma. Reminders and adversities are really important to think about in terms of understanding traumatic stress responses. And for a child with IDD, the trauma may add to significant secondary adversities related to the IDD experienced by the person and family that existed prior to the traumatic experiences. So again, they may have, they may be experiencing kind of trauma already from a number of different, sources. So, if the disability itself was caused by a traumatic brain injury or birth injury, that can impact the kind of caregiving system and the resources that were available. They may be feeling a sense of guilt, for, a kind of misperceived sense of allowing the trauma to happen to the child, or, so there's those kinds of things compound on each other. And so that may bring up reminders of those and those adversities. And trauma reminders may be particularly challenging to assess for a child with an intellectual or developmental disability, because they may not be able to communicate what is reminding them or causing kind of trauma triggers. So for example, this says, for the longest time, we couldn't understand why Billy would get so agitated for no apparent reason. We had no idea that the perfume his teacher sometimes wore reminded him of his abuser years ago. And so some of these trauma cues and trauma reminders can be very, very subtle and hard to track down. And the person may not be able to recognize or to communicate what it is, what's kind of, setting them off. And this can be important, especially for a child, who maybe has, doing a functional behavior analysis to try to understand the function of a behavior. Sometimes traumas can be the kind of wild card in that process, because there may be things that are not immediately apparent to an observer, especially for someone who doesn't kind of know their trauma history or hasn't kind of thought about how that experience may have uniquely affected that person. And so oftentimes, if there are, very confusing, behaviors or very erratic behaviors that don't seem to have clear antecedents, I think it's always worth asking and considering whether or not there may be, kind of a trauma response that's happening. Doesn't necessarily mean that's always what it is. It may be something else. But if we're not pausing and considering and taking time to think about that, we really may be missing a very big piece of the puzzle. There are also just a wide-ranging set of reactions that people could have to trauma, whether they're people with typical development or children with IDD, that trauma in adults with IDD or in children with IDD can be complicated by wide-ranging expressions of their disability. And so we have to think about, kind of how those things kind of intersect with each other. That a way that a person, who has mobility limitations or cognitive limitations may really differ because of their disability. So danger and safety is another really important concept when understanding the impact of trauma on children with IDD and how we can help them move forward. So for a person with IDD, restoring trust may take more time and different kinds of strategies that take the person's kind of unique characteristics into account. So for example, a child with IDD, who has, has multiple caregivers, who maybe has been abused at the hands of a caregiver, may really have difficulties establishing trust. Or families may have difficulty kind of establishing trust with caregivers or personal care attendants, for example. And so, we have to be really sensitive to, the sense of danger and safety. And this is really, one of our most important objectives in helping a child recover from a trauma, is to really work to try to reinstitute a sense of safety. We also have to take into account the caregiving system. So for a person with IDD, either the person, their family, and other caregivers, teachers, and community members may feel devastated by what happened to the child. They may feel overwhelmed. They may have already felt overwhelmed with the needs of the child, especially for children maybe who have complex medical or behavioral needs. And so the trauma can feel like, kind of one more kind of heap on the pile. And so we really have to be sensitive to the needs of the caregiving system as well, and think about kind of the, kind of parents or teachers and how they've been impacted, and make sure that they have are connected with sources of support and resources to cope with those. We need to think about the protective factors that are available to the child and to their caregivers. We can reassure them that there are strategies for addressing the effects of the trauma, and that these can be adapted for youth with IDD, that we can do a lot to enhance kind of already existing protective factors. So maybe kind of extended family or support networks, resources in the community, resources in the school. So we have to think about how can we maximize what's already there, what's already existing in that child's life and environment, and help them to connect with those things. There's things like social support and connection, involvement in community activities. Those are helpful for everybody who's experienced a trauma. And that's especially true for people with IDD. And then again, development, rethinking again, coming back to that idea of development and rethinking, how has this individual child's development been impacted? And, and what can we do to try to, as much as possible, kind of get them back on track? And so we need to think about all of the different ways in which that development may be impacted, kind of, behavior, cognition, all of those cognitive skills, emotion regulation skills, physiological differences, and interpersonal relationships. And so working to, try to kind of put the pieces back together and reinforce all of these areas of development are critical. So now we're going to turn to a case vignette to think about responses to traumatic experiences and think about kind of what factors might be related to trauma and what factors might be related to IDD. So let's consider the case of Suzie. Suzie is 6 years old. During recess, Suzie always plays with dolls and reenacts fight scenes over and over again. This caught her teacher's attention. Her teacher decided to chat with the school psychologist about Suzie. She has trouble making eye contact and likes to play alone. Suzie was also recently diagnosed with autism after a long process of evaluations, but still has not received behavioral services. The school psychologist was unable to complete a verbal IQ assessment, but found that she was low in most of her development and adaptive skills. Her parents are constantly arguing with the school district and are feeling unsupported in their difficulties in managing her. She cries often and only eats a few foods. She insists on lining up objects, gets upset if someone interferes with her spinning in a circle. When the psychologist inquires about the reenactment of fights in Suzie's play, the mother discloses that she and the dad sometimes raise their voices and throw objects when discussing family finances. So take a moment to think about what behaviors may be responses that are related to the IDD, and what responses may be related to the trauma. So if we go back and look at Suzie, we can see a number of things that appear to be related to having IDD or having a diagnosis of autism. So things like, kind of repetitive play, restricted and repeated interests is a hallmark feature of autism. Spinning and those sorts of behaviors, trouble making eye contact. These are kind of common features of autism. When we think about, though, what may be features of experiencing trauma, such as observing the parents arguing and potentially engaging in domestic violence with throwing objects with each other, we don't exactly know how raised the voices are getting or where those objects are being thrown. But that sounds like certainly a stressful and traumatic experience. So we have to think about kind of what are Suzie's kind of pre-existing ability to understand what's happening. When the parents are arguing, is she feeling like that is something that is her fault? She's in this kind of early childhood range of development and likely to be very egocentric and think of things as being probably her fault. And so she may be thinking that the parents are arguing about her. And maybe the parents are arguing about finances and to some extent, maybe the kind of challenges and stress of trying to get services for her, describes kind of fighting with the schools and trying to get services and trying to get behavioral services, maybe putting additional strain on an already strained family and an already strained relationship. And not to say that that's Suzie's fault, but that may be kind of a place where we see the impact of the disabilities and the impact of the kind of trauma kind of coming together. The reenactment of the fight scenes with the dolls, while she may be kind of predisposed to that repetitive behavior because of the autism, but this is also a hallmark symptom of trauma, that children who have experienced trauma often engage in the kind of repetitive play, kind of reenacting those experiences as their way of trying to make sense of their world. Not all children who reenact kind of violent play or kind of engage in violent or aggressive play have necessarily experienced a trauma. Sometimes that's a normal way of kind of mastering typical childhood fears. Children who like to pretend to be monsters or pretend to be bad guys. Sometimes those are children who are fearful of those things, and that's their way of kind of trying to master those fears. So that may be a possibility. But here, as we find out that the mother and father are engaging in a lot of arguments, it seems to suggest that perhaps those reenacting of the fight scenes are her, kind of experiencing intrusive thoughts, intrusive memories of those arguments, and she's kind of playing that out as a way of trying to master those feelings. So the point of this then is to kind of highlight some of the ways in which a child having an intellectual developmental disability, those kind of pre-existing stressors, pre-existing challenges, can compound with kind of stressful experiences, impact the way that she understands and interprets what's happening, her ability to kind of engage in coping strategies. May be limited because of, what appears to be kind of lower kind of cognitive and verbal abilities as well. So let's talk a little bit about what educators can do to address development and trauma for children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. First is to learn more about the person's moment-to-moment reactions during a traumatic event. This may be through, kind of talking with the parents, or if you're a mental health provider in the school system, talking with the child or with the parents about what that event was like. Learn about their intrinsic or internal and extrinsic factors that compromise the ecology within which the trauma occurred. Basically, that means, what are the person and the family's characteristics, the environment's characteristics that impact how that child experienced the trauma and how the caregiver experienced the trauma. Those kind of pre-existing factors and the things that happened after the trauma. Ask about trauma reminders. If a trauma is identified, either ask the caregivers or the person to the extent that they're able, or even just consider kind of, putting yourself into that experience. What might be things that might be trauma reminders? Is there a possibility that there are things in the classroom, something somebody's saying, a sound, a smell, all of those things, and especially some of those, kind of more sensory related things like sounds and smells can have really profound reactions within our brains. The kind of olfactory system kind of passes directly to our limbic system, the emotional centers in our brains. And so sometimes those things can be really powerful reminders, but very hard to detect. So take a kind of have a broader lens of potential things that could be trauma reminders. Consider their perceptions of danger and safety, and how that may have changed following the traumatic experience. Again, remembering that that in response to a trauma, a person may develop a heightened sense of fear and danger and become, more hypervigilant, and may also become more risk-taking and kind of, have a disrupted sense of danger in which they engage in more dangerous behaviors, and we may have to do more work in education helping them to understand what are safe behaviors. So that can go either way. Explore how the cultural background of the person and the caregivers may be influencing responses to traumatic experiences. We talked a little bit about this in the first part of the presentation, part one of the presentation, about the importance of understanding culture and how a person's culture influences both their understanding of disability, but also their understanding of trauma and what resources are and are not, maybe appropriate to engage in terms of responding or recovering from trauma. And so take that into account and reach out to others as needed to, for consultation. And then finally, ask if they're connected to supports and services. One of the most important things that we can do is to help people get connected to services. And it can be very challenging to find mental health providers who, have experience or are willing to work with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and especially those who have kind of experience with trauma and trauma recovery. And so there are a number of things that we can do to kind of support those families by helping them get connected. And that may be kind of reaching out to our network, forming new networks, trying to engage healthcare providers in and engaging more with children with IDD so that their kind of needs are supported. So again, I've got some resources that are available kind of listed here at the end of the slides for where to go for kind of more information on trauma-informed care generally, or for children with intellectual and developmental disabilities more specifically. So in particular, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network has a wealth of resources on trauma-informed schools, as well as resources that are specific to children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So the Road to Recovery Toolkit is a really wonderful resource specific to children with intellectual and developmental disabilities who have experienced trauma. And the book by Dr. Karen Harvey, Trauma-Informed Behavioral Interventions, is also a great resource for creating behavior plans and behavior management plans for children with intellectual disabilities who've experienced trauma in a way that really kind of honors and respects the trauma and helps them to be able to move forward. So thank you again for attending the talk, and I hope this was helpful.